This is CNN Breaking News.
Good morning. You are live in the CNN newsroom. I'm Jim Acosta in Washington. We're following breaking news from the Supreme Court. The justices have just issued an opinion on the fate of TikTok. Let me go straight to Paula Reed, who is here in Washington with me. Paula, what do we know?
Jim, huge news out of the Supreme Court as the justices uphold a controversial ban on the social media app TikTok. Now, the justices signaled that they would uphold this ban several days ago when they had oral arguments. This all started last year in April when Congress, with broad bipartisan support, said that the app would be banned if it didn't divest from its parent company, ByteDance, because of concerns over that company's ties to China. It's a national security concern that has been expressed by presidents of both parties. Specifically, the concern, Jim, is that this app is collecting data, massive amounts of data from all of its users, and then potentially that data could be used by the Chinese government, especially in the event of a crisis, to sow discord in this country or otherwise jeopardize national security. Now, TikTok, they were challenging this ban, arguing that this was a violation of the First Amendment. And when they heard arguments a few days ago, it's a rare day when you see sort of a unanimous consensus across the bench. But it was clear that the justices on both sides of the aisle were skeptical about this First Amendment argument. So as of now, unless TikTok, again, divests from its parent company by Sunday, this app could be rendered inoperable for many of its 170 million users. So far, this is definitely the biggest decision out of the Supreme Court this term. Jim?
All right, Paula, and we do have two experts here with me for instant analysis, Joan Biskupic, our Supreme Court analyst, and Carrie Cordero. Joan, I guess this doesn't come as a big surprise, but what do you make of this? I mean, there were a lot of people who were skeptical out there that this would actually take effect, that TikTok would be blocked from being used by Americans, but it sounds like that may be happening very soon.
As of this moment, on Friday, before the Sunday deadline, this ban can take effect. The Supreme Court said it was writing a narrow decision. There were no dissents. It was written unsigned, what they call per curiam. It's likely been written by Chief Justice John Roberts, but everyone signed it. Two justices wrote separately just to note some differences, but not to dissent, Justices Gorsuch and Sotomayor. And they stressed that this was narrow just in regards to what had happened to TikTok. And they said that, yes, there were some First Amendment interests, but the government's interest in its own foreign affairs, national security, overrode this, and it affirmed the lower court opinion that it said that, yes, agreed with the government. There are grave interests here in national security.
Yeah, Carrie, I mean, the knock on TikTok all along, and it's part of the reason why we're seeing this ban potentially going into place Sunday night, sounds like it will happen, is that it is essentially a backdoor for the Chinese government to get into the data of millions of Americans. And it sounds as though the Supreme Court was persuaded by that argument to the extent that they're not going to get in the way of this.
Right. So this decision, as it came down, is consistent with how it sounded the justices were going to go when they had their oral argument. It also is consistent with what the D.C. Circuit ruled. It clearly upholds the government's position, which is that the Chinese government, the Communist Chinese Party, had the ability to manipulate data of Americans that was on the app. And so it is a resounding upholding of the government's position that this posed a national security threat. I do worry long term whether this type of approach as a policy matter on behalf of the government is really sustainable, whether or not there could be another app that is also Chinese or
there are already
some
other
other
platforms.
Authoritarian country that then will also present the same types of issues, and approaching it in this law-specific way to a particular app raises questions about whether that's really a sustainable approach.
Right. There's this whole question as to whether or not the U.S. government is going to be playing whack-a-mole with these apps, because there are already people racing to these competitors of TikTok coming out of China. And Joan Biskupic, I did want to ask you, I mean, in terms of the way the justices came down on this, anything surprise you? What did you make of that?
No, I tell you what's interesting and important for the country is, within 7 days they were able to do this because they had just held arguments last Friday. They turned it around quickly. They had signaled early, which I think was good for everyone to know. So people on the Hill, the Biden administration, the incoming Trump administration, they kind of knew already what they were up against. Justice Gorsuch, who did write separately, had stood apart from the other justices as being more skeptical of the government's ban last Friday. Friday, and he has written separately. Justice Sotomayor also wrote separately. And one thing I'll mention about her, and I don't know yet if it's in her opinion now, it's 27 pages, and of course we haven't really looked at it yet, Jim, but during oral arguments, she did raise concerns about what President-elect Trump might do with any kind of executive order. You know, we've all been talking about whether the incoming president could do something to put a delay on that. She noted that under the law, the ban, it could only be suspended for the 90 days, as the law says, if there were, true negotiations going on for the sale. And she suggested that maybe that some companies might not want to risk that uncertainty and continue to service the app during the period of uncertainty. But that's just all, kind of speculative for what might happen if President-elect Trump does then go ahead on the 20th and try to do something to block this.
Well, let me ask you about that, Paula Reed. You and I were over at the White House during the first Trump administration. I seem to recall Donald Trump having a different view on TikTok back in those days. He's certainly changed his tune now, and there's some talk that he may try to put a stop to this ban, or at least temporarily pause it as he comes into the Oval Office on Monday. What do we think about that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's unclear how he would be able to do that unless he's able to broker a deal to have TikTok divest from its parent company. Because remember, this is the highest court in the land. They are upholding a law passed by Congress. But as you know, I think that it's important to point out that First Amendment protections are usually given sort of the highest scrutiny by the court. But here the court says, look, we hear your concerns about the First Amendment and about expression. And Kerry was expressing some concerns a couple of minutes ago about, well, could this holding infringe on First Amendment protections later on? The court said this. They said, we emphasize the inherent narrowness of our holding. So they're saying this decision is very narrow and specific. They're acknowledging that data collection and analysis is a common practice in the digital age. But TikTok's scale and susceptibility to foreign adversary control, together with the vast swaths of sensitive data the platform collects, justify differential treatment to address the government's national security concerns. And they're saying that laws that would target other apps that don't have this relationship with a foreign adversary would be treated differently. So they do appear to be addressing these concerns and saying, look, this is very narrow and this is specific to TikTok based on the types of data they are collecting and their allegiance to a foreign adversary. So now there's going to be a lot of pressure on the incoming administration to broker some sort of deal to separate TikTok from ByteDance, which is the only thing that would get around these national security concerns and allow them, under law, to continue operating.
Very interesting, Paul. Let me go out to Ellie. Ellie Honig is standing by. Ellie, I want to get your thoughts on all of this and whether or not Donald Trump could potentially do something coming into office on Monday. Could he put a pause on this? And I have to think for parents of teenagers out there like myself, there might be some folks doing some touchdown dances this morning because they might temporarily get some of their kids off of this highly addictive app for a while. But I mean, what are the real, I guess, real politic implications here in the coming days?
Well, I definitely feel that concern, first of all, Jim. Look, this is a devastating ruling for TikTok, not unexpected, but there are still three things that could happen that could at least temporarily save TikTok. First of all, the law says that if the president certifies that negotiations have commenced in a meaningful way, that they're working towards a deal to sell TikTok to a U.S.-based owner, that can put this law on hold for up to 90 days. So that's option number one. Number two, and a little more precipitous, the president can issue an order to the executive branch, to the Justice Department, not to enforce this law, because the way these massive fines get enforced is really through the Department of Justice. And then third, very, very unlikely, Congress could go back and either revise or repeal the law, but keep in mind, it was just passed a few months ago by massive bipartisan majorities in both the House and Senate. So I think that one is by far the least likely. But yes, and I should note, not just Donald Trump, but the president. So Joe Biden is capable of taking either of those first two steps over the next 3 days, but ultimately this will likely land on Donald Trump's desk.
Yeah, and there's so many other implications to all of this. I want to go to Brian